In this lecture, we will be examining the ideological strands within the main two parties of British politics. This serves as a nice complement to Kevin Hickson's module on British political ideologies running next semester as well. The purpose of the next 2 weeks' lectures is to give you a solid grounding in the ideology and the ideological debates occurring in the main British political parties. After this specific lecture, you should be able to understand the different ideological traditions and groupings within the two major parties, appreciate the commonalities and differences between the ideological strands within and between parties, and it would be great if you could also take some time to consider how ideologies adapt due to changing socio or economic political contexts. Whether the Conservative Party has an ideology is up for debate. The party is often described as pragmatic, sceptical of large-scale change, but willing to change in order to conserve, as Edmund Burke first articulated. Rab Butler, former Conservative Home and Foreign Secretary and Chancellor, and regarded as the best Prime Minister the Conservatives never had, spoke of conservatism as an abiding attitude of mind, a code of values, a way of life, rather than a rigid policy prescription. However, there have been clear issues or beliefs where the Conservative Party has held to dogmatically over the years. Peel's love for free trade, whilst the bulk of his party was squarely protectionist, increasing Thatcherite Eurosceptic nature of the party through the early 2000s, and the strong feelings on the Remain and Leave side of the debate within the Conservative Party, which threatened for a short period of time to split the party up until Boris Johnson had enough and kicked all the Remainers out. So, small c Conservative ideology, and we say small c to differentiate it from the ideology of the Conservative Party at any given time. Small c Conservative ideology is rooted in a negative view of human nature, so it sees humans as flawed beings, incapable of reasoning perfectly. This leads to an aversion to those of socialists, and also an aversion to central planning, which has its roots in the Christian concept of original sin, i.e., individuals are inherently flawed because they're born with original sin. In a kind of more atheistic approach, rooted in the Enlightenment, conservatives would argue that humans are incapable of being perfectly rational, and so they can make mistakes. And if they can make mistakes, then lots of people gathered together to make big decisions or large-scale planning can also make mistakes, and the bigger the scale of the consequence of those mistakes are. Following this, conservatives have a negative view of a large state. They're pessimistic of the ability of government to plan large-scale projects efficiently, and so they see individuals as best placed to make decisions about their own life. And this is underpinned by property rights, i.e. the state can't just decide to take away your property. The distrust of the state is coupled with a view of society as organic, like an organism, with each part, so for example each class, each gender, each region, each age group having its own unique role to the benefit of society as a whole, as well as having responsibilities to one another. So whereas conservatives would say liberals see the social contract as one just of rights, I have a right to free speech, I have a right to safety, I have a right to whatever, conservatives say, well, actually we have rights and responsibilities to one another. So yes, you have a right to free speech, but you also have a responsibility to cooperate in the social life of an area. Now, the complexity and interconnectedness of organisms is not limited by the skill of a human designer, but rather evolves naturally for years of any human. These social bonds arise organically. You can't take a group of people and plan out their social interactions and how their communities will form. It is completely natural. Even minor social engineering must be considered with the greatest care because of its possible effect upon other parts of the living body of state or society. So instead of planning in advance to make changes to one area, conservatives instead look to tradition, because tradition is an important guide as to what has gone before and as what works. In the conservative understanding, tradition is valued because it is a glue which holds society together, as an example of what works. The political system, tradition, represent the accumulated wisdom of the community over generations. So, Since change is inherently risky with no guarantee of success, it's a case of better the devil you know. So conservatives are wary of what they see change in case it upsets the social order. So with this view of organic society, with each part having its own role to play, coupled with tradition, lends itself to the endorsement of hierarchy and to an emphasis on the responsibility and obligations of those in positions of privilege to those who aren't in positions of privilege, without necessarily a desire to challenge those in a privileged position or their right to be in a privileged position. Organic society suggests that there's also a national interest which is greater than a class or a sectoral interest. In an organism, no one organ has supremacy, and so it should be for the nation, right? So if we think of the body as the nation, it makes no sense really to prioritize your kidneys over your heart, because if your heart stops, your kidneys won't work, and if your kidneys don't work, your heart won't work, and the body will die. And so conservatives, we can see this in Disraeli's thoughts of one nation that we'll come to later, but essentially he argued that the national whole is being threatened by the condition that poorer people were being kept in. And so the state had a role to play in improving their conditions, the conditions of the poor, in order to save the nation as a whole. Otherwise, revolution. Finally, conservatives are strong defenders of property rights. And although, by their very nature, property rights enshrine inequalities, property rights are the essential characteristic of the established order which conservatism seeks to defend. Property gives an individual a stake in society, thereby offering an inducement towards social stability. However, conservatism as an ideology has faced two key tensions. The first is the tension between stability and change. So, for example, as we said last week, the Tories would typically be opposed to any change, even if that threatened social stability, for example, the Great Reform Act. It was the Conservatives, really, that articulated this Burkean notion of change in order to conserve. So you need to make small changes in order to preserve the whole for the greater good. But it is always a value judgment about what needs to be changed and what needs to be conserved. And within that value judgment, there is room for disagreement. There is also the conflict within conservatism between liberty and paternalism. If you subscribe to the idea that a large state is bad because individuals aren't perfect, they make mistakes, a large state is just more decide how people live their lives to exercise political power, then that will push you in the direction of a smaller state and increased individual liberty or autonomy. However, if you have this concept of an organic society where each part is dependent on other parts in order to operate effectively, and for example, the poor or perhaps ethnic minorities are hard done by, then you will want to use the role of you will want to use the power of the state in order to address those inequalities. And so we get a tension between liberty and paternalism, and you can see this perhaps in quite simplistic terms between maybe Mayism and her discussion about burning injustices. So liberty versus paternalism. And that is a very real debating point at the moment. However, this ideology of conservatism is more of a guiding principle or an instinct. The Conservative Party is typically described as pragmatic rather than an ideological party, and they believe that ideology should be subordinated to the realities of governing, so the politics of power, and the need to win elections, the politics of support, i.e., conservatism as an ideology or as a way of life is often used as a tool in order to promote electoral. If elements of conservatism are seen to be electorally unpopular, conservatives are more likely to jettison or evolve some of those ideas in order to win office. Despite this, key strands of conservative ideology do exist. Terms you might recognise are one-nation conservatism, Thatcherism, Cameronism or liberal conservatism, and red Toryism, and we'll cover a lot. So the first subgenre of conservative ideology we'll look at is one-nation conservatism. Benjamin Disraeli, two-time Prime Minister between 1868 and 1890, developed an idea of one-nation conservatism to appeal to working-class voters following the expansion of the franchise. He called it one-nation conservatism, but later adherents have given it that name. In his novel, Sybil, or The Two Nations, Disraeli examined the gap between the wealthy elite and the working classes. Disraeli wrote that the two nations were as ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts and feelings as if they were inhabitants of different planets. Disraeli argued that it was in the interests of the ruling elite to adopt the stance of paternalism towards those less fortunate. For instance, the provision of a safety net for the unemployed would alleviate the most acute forms of poverty. More importantly, it would prevent the emergence of revolutionary consciousness amongst the working class or the disaffected. This was an alternate method to address class inequality to that put forward by Marx. Disraeli's government introduced a new Factory Act meant to protect workers, legislated to allow peaceful picketing and to enable workers to sue employers in the civil courts if they broke legal contracts. As a result of these social reforms, the Liberal Labour MP Alexander MacDonald told his constituents in 1879, the Conservative Party have done more for the working class in 5 years than the Liberals have in 50. However, by the end of the 19th century, the Conservatives had moved towards a more free market ideology. One Nation conservatism as a label formally emerged in the post-war era, with key figures including Macmillan, Rab Butler and Edward Heath. In the post-war period, One Nation politics embodied an active state, which was the key player in ameliorating social problems. This saw an acceptance of the post-war consensus from the 1950s, a relatively large welfare state, a mixed economy, and a tripartite approach to industrial relations, which brought together government, employers and trade unions. One Nation conservatism is a pragmatic and relatively non-ideological approach to politics, based on the need for flexibility. Social stability is seen as more important than ideological dogmatism, and it is justified in order to prevent revolution or the onset of some paternalistic idea is core. You create social unity via state aid to the worst off in society, with an obligation of the rich to help the less well off, via taxes or charity. However, this was not unlimited. Conservatives also equally encouraged individual and community provision of goods, as well as individual responsibility in some areas. There's also a respect for the individual. Although the state should be active in society, where possible, it should also respect individual freedom and the ability of an individual to flourish. And this is still a tangible strand within the Conservative Party. Theresa May referred to herself as a One Nation Tory when she became Prime Minister, as does Boris Johnson, and so did Cameron occasionally. In fact, in 2010, then Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, explained his political philosophy as being a One Nation Tory. There is a duty on the part of the rich to the poor and to the needy. But you're not going to help people express that duty and satisfy if you punish them fiscally so viciously that they leave this city and this country. That was Boris in 2010. Thatcherism is the British variant of the New Right movement prominent in the 1980s, which combined economic liberalism with a social and moral conservatism. Thatcherism, in the UK context, wasn't just an ideology, it was also a style of politics. Thatcher set herself out as a conviction politician, which put her apart from the conservative pragmatician. Ideologically, Thatcherism stood for free markets, reduced government spending, tax cuts and a strong patriotism. Thatcherites claimed the country had become overtaxed, overgoverned and undisciplined. On a social level, Thatcherism is often described as holding a conservative stance on morality. The Marxist sociologist and founder of the New Left Review, Stuart Hall, for example, argued that Thatcherism should be viewed as an ideological project promoting authoritarian populism, since it is known for its reverence of Victorian values. However, despite her association with social conservatism, Thatcher voted in 1966 to legalise homosexuality, one of the few Conservative MPs to do so. That same year, she also voted in support of abortion. However, as Prime Minister, she also introduced Section 28 of the Local Government Act 1988, which opposed the intentional promotion of homosexuality by local authorities and promotion of the teaching of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretend family relationship in schools. So Thatcherism was a rejection of the post-war consensus, that is Keynesianism, corporatism, a large welfare state, nationalised industry and a close regulation of the British economy. And it emerged in Thatcher at a specific socio-economic juncture during the winter of discontent. Unions were seen as too powerful, the British economy was seen as sluggish and unproductive, and inflation was far too high. But is Thatcherism conservative? So there's a debate around whether Thatcherism does actually represent conservative values, or if it's simply just classical liberalism in the economic sphere and traditionalism in the social sphere. It can be argued that Thatcherism emphasised different elements of conservative philosophy compared to the One Nation strand. So in this case, individual responsibility instead of paternalism came to the fore, free markets instead of corporatism, conviction politics rather than consensus politics. However, for Thatcherites, society was not seen as organic, but rather individualistic or atomistic. The key focus wasn't organic society as a whole, but it was the individual. In many ways, Thatcherism was seen as an alien import into the conservative tradition. That's by Evans, 2009, page 103. But for her part, Thatcher dismissed One Nation Tories as little more than social democrats. There was, however, overlap with One Nation conservatism. Strong leadership, private property, and the role of markets in prosperity, the role of rights and obligations, and there was some overlap with Heath's free market ideas before his big U-turn. Thatcher also rhetorically utilised One Nation traditions vis-à-vis patriotism and property-owning democracy to usher in many things which would later be seen as Thatcherite. So Thatcherism was in some ways as much a reaction to One Nation conservatism as it is, or as it was, to the socio-economic context of the 1970s and the post-war consensus. A third strand of conservative ideology has come to the forefront of the party, liberal conservatism. This was a term used by Cameron to describe himself, and proponents argued that it married the economic liberalism of Thatcherism with a new social liberalism. Others claim, however, that Cameronism was just reheated One Nation conservatism, as mentioned, to describe himself at some point, whilst those on the left just said that Cameronism was Thatcherism. So Cameron as a One Nation conservative. Well, it does appear that Cameron has intentionally tacked his party's policies and ideas to the left of the party in search of the broader centre ground in non-Thatcherite ways. For example, Cameronism responded to New Labour's dominance in the area of public services by initially endorsing their investment strategy and calling for further deeper reform. However, the financial crisis heralded in an era of austerity in British politics and successive cuts to the welfare state, unless you were a pensioner, which undermined the claims to be a One Nation conservative to some extent. However, even in the post-war consensus, stop-start economics was common on both One Nation conservatives and the right of the Labour Party, who both recognised the need to balance the books to some extent. For Beach, Cameron's free market economic ideals, his Euroscepticism, and his claims to give people power over the king rather than a paternalistic approach positioned his politics outside of the traditional One Nation conservative stable. So, what about Cameron as a New Right or Thatcherite adherent? Well, it's worth noting that under Cameron, Tory MPs are more Thatcherite in outlook than at any time before, even under Thatcher. This has a lot to do with the demise of the One Nation tradition of conservatism within the parliamentary party. Beach argues Cameron can be understood as Thatcherite inasmuch as he is a free marketeer who desires less state intervention in the economy and in the lives of British citizens. For Cameron and George Osborne, lower taxes were both an economic good and a moral good because it gives people freedom. Not only has Cameronism been imbued with Thatcherite political economy, but also with Thatcher's Euroscepticism. Cameron, although seen as on the Remain wing of the party, was still much more Eurosceptic than One Nation conservatives would have been. He just wasn't Euro-rejectionist. He pulled his MEPs out of the mainstream centre-right European Parliament group in order to better oppose European federalism and economic protectionism, which EEP members support. However, Cameron isn't a full-on individualist or neoliberal, a philosophical creed which puts the individual at the centre of political social life. Cameronism values marriage, family, and nation as institutions, which provide a shared or common identity and help hold society together. So, Cameron as a liberal conservative. The term liberal in liberal conservative plays a variety of roles. It is a marketing tool to show Cameron's conservatism is a rejection of social conservatism, to show that he is centre-right, not right-wing. It allows Cameron to show he's pro-freedom, individual liberty, low tax, public choice in public services. And internationally, it suggests an opposition to neoconservatism and, ironically for Cameron, multilateralism and cooperation with other states. Liberal conservatism is a combination of neoliberal economic outlook, aka Thatcherism, Euroscepticism, again Thatcherite, but more left-wing liberal social policy. He is not a social authoritarian nor a Victorian moralist, but he does value institutions such as marriage, family, monarchy and the union. It's also worth stating that he ran the 2010 general election on the idea of the big society, which was a rejection of pure individualism, but also questioned the extent to which the state should be enrolled in people's life. Civil society should also have a role, the charities, social groups, whatever. So in the same way that Thatcherism influenced New Labour's influenced Thatcherism to create Cameronism. A Thatcherite outlook sees the importance of the public sector, of environmentalism, of social justice, etc., etc. As such, Cameronism can be seen as post-Thatcherite, not anti-Thatcherite. It's economically neoliberal. It's got a vaguely one-nation approach to social policy, Eurosceptic in a Thatcherite fashion, if not Euro-rejectionist, but Tory in terms of tradition and institutions. And finally, it's also important to note that Cameronism as a governing philosophy, i.e. what he did in office, emerged as a result of or in the context of the financial crisis. And it is completely possible that without the financial crisis, austerity wouldn't have been on the agenda and Cameronism would have looked completely different to what we actually have today. Heppel in 2013 found that the Parliamentary Conservative Party has three significant splits based on divides between social liberalism and conservatism, hard and soft Euroscepticism, but not economic divides, which is interesting, I think, especially given the old Thatcherite one nation divisions. So Cameroons are socially liberal but soft Eurosceptics, and they're around 13% of the PCP in 2010 to 15. Socially conservative and hard Eurosceptic MPs make up 16% of the 2010 to 15 PCP. And then what Heppel calls Thatcherite, which is socially conservative and soft Eurosceptic, and they make up the bulk of the rest. In the 2016 Conservative leadership election, support for May, Leadsom and Gove was split along two divides in MPs, whilst the Leave vote was split between socially conservative Leavers who backed Andrea Leadsom and socially liberal Leavers who backed Michael Gove. So to see the Leavers, at least at this time, as a cohesive whole misses nuances within their rank. And finally, under Theresa May, well actually by the end of Theresa May's time, and then under Boris Johnson got rid of pretty much most of the hardest remainers in the party to kind of completely end that split in effect. So this section will probably contain new types of ideologies that you're not really familiar with. So if you need to listen to it a few times, that's no problem. And also it's probably something you should do a little bit more research on than you might otherwise, because I think it will be a key battleground of analysing conservative ideological evolution from the Brexit vote onwards. So Red Toryism is a creed which has its roots in Canadian conservatism, and in the UK has been most forcibly articulated by Philip Blond in his book Red Tory. At the core of Red Tory ideology is a mixture of communitarian ideas that individuals thrive when they feel part of a close and local community, and social conservatism, defending the family and other social institutions. Economically, Red Toryism rejects the idea of free market capitalism as amoral and value-free, and instead recognises the role it may have on building or breaking communities. And it thus, as a result, wants to give power over the market to local communities. As such, Red Tories return to the ideas of Edmund Burke, who argued that conservatism should be centred on the little platoons of family and civic associations. Burke said, to love the little platoon which we belong to in society is the first principle of public affections. It is the first link in the series by which we proceed towards a love of our country and to mankind. Socially, Red Tories are anti-liberal, as liberalism is seen to undermine societal bonds. To paraphrase Blond, so extreme did the defence of individual liberty become that each man was obliged to refuse the dictates of another, for that would simply be to replace rule by one man's will, the king, with rule by another. Real people are formed by the society of others. For liberals, autonomy must precede everything else, but such a self is fiction. A society so constituted would be one that required a powerful central authority, the perpetual conflict between self-interested individuals. So, the unanticipated bequest of an unlimited liberalism is the most illiberal of entities, the controlling state. Conservatives who believe in value, culture, and truth should therefore think twice before calling themselves liberal. Liberalism can only be a virtue when linked to the politics of the common good, a problem which the best liberals, Mill, Adam Smith, and Gladstone, recognised but could never resolve. A vision of the good life cannot come from liberal principles. So that was Blonde. Red Tories are critical of both post-war economic settlements, state-sponsored Keynesianism, and Blonde argues that these economic settlements have eliminated civil society and allowed the power of communities to be held by the state or the market. He argued, unlimited liberalism produces atomised relativism and state absolutism. Insofar as both the Tories and Labour have been contaminated by liberalism, the true left-right legacy of the post-war period is, unsurprisingly, a centralised authoritarian state and fragmented and dissociative society. Blonde disliked the Keynesianism of the post-war era because it took power away from individuals, from communities, and centralised it in the state. For example, NHS took local hospital functions from local councils, local authorities, and centralised it in Whitehall in the Department of Health. Whereas Thatcherism, as a economic framework, again, prioritised the individual, not society or not community, and so undermined society from that end, or undermined communities from that end. So both Keynesianism and Thatcherism undermine local communities, but from different angles. Blonde argued for 4 policies to begin the Red Tory revolution and build vibrant local economies, namely relocalising our banking system through expanded office banking arm, developing local capitalism through local investment trusts, giving councils the right to issue bonds and encouraging anchor institutions, such as universities, to spend locally, similar to what is happening in Preston, helping normal people gain new assets through microfinancing, and breaking up big business monopolies. Blonde says the final piece of the Red Tory puzzle is for Conservatives to break with big business. Other policies that were floated included stopping repossession of homes through an ombudsman which will treat both landlord and tenant equally, a living wage, not a minimum wage, and challenging speculation within the economy. Blonde was initially hopeful for Cameron's Big Society project, but became quickly disappointed, writing in 2012 that Cameron's credit was that he spoke to the Red Tory idea and offered a realisation of the Big Society, a whole package of measures to add to community empowerment, civic life and community business. But with austerity, a failure to rethink the party's economic offer means that old economics has killed new politics. Now, others have said Theresa May was a Red Tory. Theresa May herself defines herself as a one-nation conservatism and said that the party must move on from the caricature of Thatcherism or Thatcherite conservatism. She also set out plans for greater state intervention in company boardrooms, schools and the energy sector. The 2017 Conservative Manifesto claimed, "We must reject the ideological templates provided by the socialist left and the libertarian right, and instead embrace the mainstream view that recognises the good that government can do." This is not Thatcherite. Blonde wrote that May's popularity was at its height when she offered a Red Tory vision of economic and social transformation, equal to the problems that we face. Whilst her advisor, Nick Timothy, pushed for a more muscular state, willing to intervene with measures such as an energy price cap, and coupled with a tough talk on immigration and Brexit. This was designed to target left-behind communities, those who were understood to have voted Leave in a cry of anger against a system that does not work for them, or they feel does not care for their views. However, there have been other perspectives about Theresa May's ideology. So Goes argues that Theresa May's one-nation conservatism could be seen in her dismissal of ideological grand plans and a commitment to seeking balance in society, so the state has a role to playing out smoothing the worst of the free market over. As a side note, there are overlaps with the ideology of Christian democratic parties in Europe in May, especially around the idea of a communal moral purpose and a common good, rooted in her idea that true conservatism means a belief not just in society but in the good that government can do, a respect for local and national institutions that bind us together, which is at the heart of Christian democracy also. Similarly, so is the idea that the state should supplement, not supplant, non-governmental bonds of solidarity, So they should enforce cooperative bargains between labour and industry. They should defend property relief and property ownership for workers and give or help to give workers a greater say over companies. However, unlike left-wing thinkers, May does not believe in equality, so she prefers to talk about fairness and meritocracy. May was contrasted with Thatcher, often simply due to their gender, but their religious upbringing might also shine light on some of their values. According to Nick Spencer, May's Anglo-Catholicism is more collective and it rejects economic and social liberalism than Thatcher's Methodism, which was individualistic in nature. For Hickson et al., whilst May is not as instinctively socially liberal as Cameron, she is influenced by a Christian upbringing to be both less cosmopolitan and more collectivist, perhaps fitting quite nicely with the somewheres of David Goodhart. In her 2016 party conference speech, she stated, "If you believe you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. You don't understand what the very word citizenship means." This led to Twitter to blow a fuse, and Vince Cable said the speech could have come from Mein Kampf, which was probably a little bit of an exaggeration. May, however, in a rejection of Thatcherism, recognised that there were major long-term social disadvantages beyond. Unlike in the 1980s, when Thatcherism sought to blame individuals for their own shortcomings, often from a moral perspective. And this led May to talk about social justice in a way which out and out rejected Thatcherism and challenged the small state instincts of Cameronism. The best example of this was the burning injustices speech that she gave on the doorstep of number 10. So basically, when it comes to Mayism, who knows? May's rhetoric suggested a move towards a more one-nation approach where the individual, prioritised in Thatcherism and Cameronism, was not reified. The state had a greater role to play and collective activism action was necessary to address some social issues. However, a mixture of the poor 2017 general election campaign, a minority government, Brexit, all meant that non-Brexit policies had to take a back seat, and Mayism will remain a vague and undiscernible doctrine. It's also, when we talk about Red Toryism, important to remember the context within which Red Toryism formed. So it formed in the context of the financial crisis, and after 20 or so years, maybe 30, of a prioritisation of neoliberal economics and individualism. And so Red Toryism, or at least it could be argued in some respects, that Red Toryism is a re-articulation of one-nation values for a new context, or at least seeks to occupy the space opposite Thatcherism that one-nation conservatism used. It might be too early to define what Boris Johnson's ideology is. As mentioned in the past, he has portrayed himself as a one-nation conservative. There's no doubt that the government has spent more than anyone would expect them to spend, but then whether we would have seen that without COVID is obviously hard to say. Some people think Johnson doesn't have an ideology, that he just says what he thinks to get into power. Some people think he's a bit of a charlatan or a liar, and they point to his time at the Telegraph. But others just think he is an entertainer. So for Heppel, Johnson is a classic conservative in that his primary objective is to hold office. And he did this through the mobilisation of the Leave vote in the 2019 general election. This obviously invoked Euroscepticism, but also rejecting Thatcherite economic liberalism and Cameronite liberal conservatism. He pledged to level up the country through increased spending and government intervention in that economy. So, more government-backed infrastructure projects, national minimum wage boost, things like that. Crines argues that Johnson also played a more patriotic card than previous Leavers, which was especially effective against Jeremy Corbyn, and praised the Union in the leadership campaign. He also emphasised issues of crime and immigration, taking a very socially traditionalist approach than perhaps Cameronite liberal conservatism. Heppel argues that a combination of economic dampness, national independence and social conservatism is a distinct variant of contemporary British conservatism, which could be described as populist conservatism. However, I think Johnsonism is within the same ballpark as Mayism, but delivered more effectively and more charismatically by Johnson. We see more economic intervention, for example, banning buy one get one free deals on junk food, just as the tip of the iceberg, alongside the aforementioned levelling up through targeted infrastructure investment and tough talk on immigration crime and the importance of community and rootedness. However, the jury is still out whether we can separate COVID reactions to actual overarching ideology, or whether the government's in panic mode is something that we'll have to look back on in a year or two's time. So these graphs might help you conceptualize or locate the different ideological strands that we've covered. Although important to note that the centre here is the centre of the Conservative Party rather than the public or ideology as a whole. So yeah, you might be able to see this on the economic liberalism, economic intervention scale, individualism, communitarianism, or social liberalism, social conservatism scale. Unlike continental socialist parties, revolutionary and Marxist approaches have had much less impact in the UK. The Labour Party itself was set up to represent trade unions in Parliament and to reduce legal restrictions on trade unions so that they could operate within a capitalist system free from onerous legal restrictions. Historically, there were three sets of influences over the Labour Party. The first was Christian and ethical roots of the party's socialism, and this took the view that competitive capitalism leaves many disadvantaged and in poverty. The essential dignity of man means this is morally wrong. The goal of political life should be to reduce inequality possible. There was also a scientific socialist strand, which saw a top-down approach to government planning to deliver socialist outcomes. So, for example, a technocratic Fabian society. And it wasn't really concerned with empowering citizens, more the idea that we can use scientific methods to improve the lot of the people in total. So yeah, it was very much a top-down approach rather than empowering. Politics was something you did to people rather than necessarily for people. And organised labour. Labourist approach which argued that workers must organise to challenge exploitative capitalists and to redistribute wealth. The aim was to protect and advance working class living standards rather than necessarily class war, for instance. And the key principles within the Labour Party were equality, redistribution, common ownership of industry, and parliamentary democracy. So parliamentary democracy, not revolution. Now you contrast this to the conservative ideology, which sees socialism as a belief can be understood as an attempt to address the same issues in society as Benjamin Disraeli's one nation concept. The tensions within Labour were numerous, reflecting the different strands and groups which came together to form the British Labour Party and the British left more broadly. So you had the tension between ethical socialism and scientific socialism. So the key tension here is about whether socialism should come from the bottom up or the top down. Is socialism something which should be done by the people or to the people? And what is the role of experts in this? There was also the conflict between trade unionism and wider interests. So Labour governments were typically torn between acting in the national interest and perhaps damaging the trade union interest, for example, in trying to reduce inflation, or vice versa. So in 1969, for example, Harold Wilson, Labour Prime Minister, shied away from implementing reform of the unions, which he considered to be in the public interest, because of unionist pressures from within his own party. And then there was also the conflict between fundamentalism versus gradualism, or revolutionism versus parliamentary socialism. Gradualists had a clear agenda of general social reform to be achieved, but they favoured separate small steps rather than great leaps. For some who wanted to see revolution or revolutionist approach, this wasn't good enough, and often they would splinter away from the Labour Party. Historically, the Labour Party has been much more clearly split internally compared to the Conservatives. Although the Conservatives, when they decide to split, they do it in a big way. Between those on the left of the party and those on the so-called right of the party, who are typically described as social democrat, moderates or centre-left. During the post-war era, Labour was split between two wings broadly: the Gateskiellites on the right of the party, led by Hugh Gateskill, and the Bevanites on the left of the party, led by Bevan. One of the key Gateskiellite thinkers was Anthony Crosland. In his book, The Future of Socialism, he argued that many of the Labour Party's key aims had been achieved in the 1945 to 51 government, and that nationalisation of industry in itself did not necessarily improve the lot of the worker. We might have spoke about this in the previous lecture, where the the nationalisation of key industries just replaced managers with government bureaucrats in Whitehall who were still far removed from the average working person. For Gateskielites, the key aim of the party should be equality, achieved via market-led economic growth, followed by a progressive redistributionist strategy of taxation to support social welfare. Furthermore, to see socialism as solely national ownership was too prescriptive, and instead Crossland argued for a version of socialism which focused on outcome rather than process, socialism as an ethical goal rather than a step-by-step roadmap. Additionally, by Gateskielites, the trade unionists were regarded with suspicion. The economy should be run in a national interest rather than the interest of or the benefits of trade unions. Social equality was seen as more important. This was contrasted on the left of the party by the wing known as the Bevanites, and they were more influenced by Marxist thinking, by the labour movement, and maybe today known as the old left. Policy positions included a strong commitment to nationalisation. Nationalisation was seen as good in and of itself, comprehensive and free welfare state, including housing, scepticism towards America and American foreign policy, split over the issue of nuclear weapons, but they were certainly anti-NATO. And although Bevanism as a parliamentary group typically faded away after Bevan's death, the New Left infused some Bevanite ideas with the idea of social justice and things like advancing rights for homosexuals, improving race relations, things like that, gender equality and environmentalism, this New Left idea that was fused with kind of Bevanism under the banner of democratic socialism, or Benism, under Tony Benn in the 1970s and 80s, and which is broadly the ideology that Corbyn himself subscribed to. And so within this the Bevanite and also Bennite tradition, nationalisation is good in and of itself, rather necessarily than because of the outcomes it provides. So the means are just as important as the ends. But the key point here is that the splits that we might see between Labour's centrist wing and Labour's left wing have always been part of the Labour Party in one form or another. The third way emerged in a new societal context of globalisation. According to thinkers like Anthony Giddens, society was facing a series of dilemmas which rendered the opposing philosophies of the New Right and the statist social democracy increasingly irrelevant. There was globalisation, increasing individualism, the irrelevance of left and right, the decline of democratic institutions, and environmental degradation. The third way drew on Christian socialism, liberalism, and social democracy, and so presented a way of realising traditional centre-left values like liberty, social justice, democracy, community obligation, but within changed circumstances. It argued for a form of social justice without collectivism. Equality was about inclusion, and redistribution was about the redistribution of possibilities rather than money, right? The welfare state was out and social investment state was in. This would help promote individual capacity. For Blair, this was fine. He said what matters is what works, and for a time it seemed like the third way did work. Giddens himself argues that the third way was not actually a major break for Labour ideology, and it harks back to the Crosslandite idea of socialism as rather than a rigid guide or policy prescription. The third way stood for a modernised social democracy, passionate in its commitment to the goals of the centre-left, but flexible, innovative, and forward-looking in the means to achieve them. And that's what Blair said in 1998. The third way approach formed the basis of New Labour, which can be summarised as a rejection of the traditional distinction between state and market, public and private, a scepticism towards state enterprise, a supportive attitude towards private ownership and thus towards privatisation, a willingness to experiment the application of market disciplines in the provision and management and delivery of public service, a rejection of the traditionally close relationship between Labour and the unions, a belief in the virtues of devolved government and creating a new style of inclusive as opposed to adversarial politics involving further constitutional reform, and a general sympathy towards consumer-orientated values rather than traditional collectivist ones. During New Labour, we also see emergence of a Blairite-Brownite split, named after the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, and his Chancellor and successor as Prime Minister, Gordon Brown. The New Statesman summarised this quite well. If Blairite initially meant policies or people aligned with Blair's ideology, meaning the basics, public service investment, an Atlanticist interventionist foreign policy, a focus on education and stronger law enforcement, then it quickly came to mean not a Brownite. Whilst Brownite has been used to describe people brown, Giddens claimed that in contrast to Blairite, the adjective used to refer to the political ideology of Tony Blair, Brownites tend to be less enthusiastic about market-driven solutions such as tuition fees and foundation hospitals, and more keen on the role of the state. They're less critical of Labour's links to the unions and more critical of media management techniques such as the use of spin doctors. Although these are not fully fleshed out ideological positions, they're often used as journalistic shorthands for tribes or perceived loyalty. So the Third Way and New Labour can basically be understood as a social democratic response to Thatcherism, specifically individualism. And for many on the left, this wasn't a left-wing or a Labour ideology at all. It was just a way of managing Thatcherism, managing capitalism and individualism more effectively. Ed Miliband defined his ideology as one nation Labour, an obvious play on one nation conservatism, and sold as the successor ideologically to New Labour. First used at the 2012 Labour Party conference and aimed to create a narrative of uniting the country. This was against the backdrop of the coalition government's austerity policies. This was a post-New Labour position. It accepted the need to appeal to Middle England, as New Labour did, but it rejected New Labour's legacy in other areas. Drawing on a Blue Labour tradition, One Nation Labour also emphasised both rights and responsibilities. Miliband argued New Labour did not do enough to change the balance of power in this country, and that New Labour was right to talk about rights and responsibilities, but was too timid in enforcing them, especially at the top of society. Now, unlike New Labour, Miliband was fine using the word socialism, but again, similar to Crossland, he saw socialism as a framework rather than a prescriptive guide to economic policy. He said, "My kind of socialism is a set of values based on notions of social justice. Socialism as a rigid form of economic determinism has ended, and rightly. Hence, One Nation Labour is pro-capitalism, but a capitalism that works for the people." Stuart Wood, in 2003, Labour peer Ed Miliband Spad, said, The One Nation Labour approach includes a different way of organising our political and economic life. Miliband argued for a change in the structure of the market to ensure a more equal distribution of economic power, increasing productivity to boost wages, supporting key industries and, similar to Red Tory and Blue Labour perspectives, protecting the elements of common life or elements of society. Milibandism also proposed a challenge to the ethic of the post-79 settlement, change the norms and ethical underpinnings of the country's political economy. Wood states that a one-nation approach embraces the importance of individual freedom, but rejects the idea that individualism, pursued by each, magically meets the interests of all. So it was not an idea of atomistic individualism that perhaps both Thatcherism and New Labour and liberal conservatism pursues, but closer to the Red Toryism, this idea of community being important. So why wasn't Milibandism more successful? Well, One Nation Labour was seen as an empty slogan for many, or too full. Every policy was seen as one nation. As a concept, it didn't really have much analytical use. Labour still not moved on far enough from New Labour, which was still widely blamed for the financial crisis, and it wasn't helped by many New Labour MPs in the shadow cabinet. And Ed Miliband himself was not really a respected or trusted messenger. He wasn't seen as an effective leader either, rightly or wrongly. And the close link between One Nation Labour and Ed Miliband meant that the concept of One Nation Labour either rose or fell with the fate of Ed Miliband. This wasn't a concept that emerged from, say, think tanks or anything like that. It was very much a leader-driven ideology. George Eaton, of the New Statesman, argued that at its core, Corbynism rests on four pillars: economic interventionism, nationalisation and redistribution, foreign non-interventionism, as that's opposition to military action, social liberalism, and participatory movement politics. Bolton and Pitts argue that Corbynism is a mixture of the traditional left strand within the Labour Party, represented by Corbyn himself, Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell, and mixes 80s issue Bennite economic nationalism with a Leninist central party planning and a reflexive anti-imperialism sourced from the 70s New Left. What this means in layman's terms is that you take this idea of Bennite economic nationalism, Britain should nationalise its key industries and they should be run for the good of the British people. Leninist central party planning, the Labour Party HQ should guide the Labour Party as a whole, and that should be the kind of central source of authority. And a reflexive anti-imperialism sourced from the 70s New Left, which is basically shorthand for anti-NATO, anti-Americanism, and a reflex to fall on the side of typically kind of marginalised countries. Now, this traditional left strand, argues Bolton and Pitts, is mixed with a new and youthful post-capitalist techno-utopian wing, which is epitomised by figures such as Paul Mason and Novara Media's Aaron Bastani. This sees technological advancement, specifically automation, as the end of work as we know it and a route out of wage-slave dynamics, especially for those within the precariat, if not the working class as a whole. Bolton and Pitts also note that both Corbynism and Blue Labour see the world in essentially national terms, although Blue Labour Corbynism unnecessarily rejecting patriotism in favour of a borderless world. At its core, Corbynism is defined by a steadfast ability in the nation-state to eradicate inequality and poverty through a radical programme of intervention in the domestic economy. Bassett argues that Corbyn's Labour is not as radical as it makes out to be. Instead, Corbyn's Labour is a deeply social democratic one. He argues that Corbynism still adheres to Labourism, which Ralph Miliband argued represented Labour's fatal flaw. In being committed to parliamentary politics under capitalism, Labour MPs, whether working class or not, become transformed into members of the ruling capitalist class when they enter Parliament. For Miliband then, the electoral road to socialism required bold governments supported by extra parliamentary movements to keep these representatives grounded. In the 1970s, John McDonnell in the Greater London Council put this into action by opening the Greater London Council's doors to activists in the capital, lending particular support to cultural interventions that promoted municipal socialism, sexual liberation and anti-racism, all of which were labelled by conservatives and the popular press as mark of the loony left. On the face of it, Bassett notes the role of momentum and the emphasis on transformative. However, momentum was designed by John Landman as a group which would help the Labour left win internal party elections and push for constitutional rule changes that would move the party's centre of power away from MPs and towards affiliated trade unions and the membership, who was seen as being on the left. Momentum's greatest successes have been Labour Party related, internal elections, campaigning, rather than building a people-powered politics that goes beyond the Labour Party and that can be critical of the Labour Party. Similarly, policy-wise, Corbynism wasn't very radical at all. As Bassett argues, Corbyn's anti-austerity agenda in fact proposes to restore a new Labour-level balance in tax and spend. The single biggest increase in taxation proposed in 2017 would have seen corporation tax rise to a level below its new Labour average. Bassett finishes with the argument that there's not a drop of evidence, however, that Corbyn's party seeks to erase private ownership, competition or the profit motive. The original wording of Clause 4 of Labour's constitution, to secure for the workers the means of production, distribution and exchange, has not been resurrected. So in this regard, Bassett argues that Corbynism was more post-neoliberal than radical, and definitely not social. So, where does this leave Labour today? Well, there are a few competing visions that we will look at. Blue Labour, the Purple Book or Purple Labour, and the Red Book. Blue Labour was an intellectual project led by Labour peer and academic Maurice Glassman. The broad thrust of Blue Labour was philosophical rather than policy-orientated, but similar to Blonde's Red Toryism, Blue Labour is a critique of economic and cultural liberalism within Labour elites. It is a communitarian form of social democracy which emphasises democratic civil society over the power of the centralised state, which is viewed with heavy distrust. Blue Labour claims to retrieve a Labour tradition of mutualism, in which a concept of a concrete common good takes priority over notions of universality and equality. A tradition which, it claims, has been central to the party's foundation but abandoned as the Attlee government inherited the war-honed machinery of state power. The key argument is that the best check on capital is through democratic association, e.g. community groups, trade unions and cooperatives, and these need to be built on values of reciprocity, mutuality and solidarity. However, for Blue Labour enthusiasts, after the Second World War, Labour has given far too much power to the central state. Although social democratic states seek to intervene benevolently, its actions and its increasing remit have instead undermined social virtues once characteristic of working class communities throughout the nation. The resultant effect has been a national poverty of fraternity, cooperation and societal bonds. In addition, a damage of the social democratic state has been economic dependence, which, according to Blue Labour, has been actively endorsed by Labour governments from Attlee to Brown. As a result of this, the key critique from Blue Labour of New Labour, according to Jonathan Rutherford, is that Labour is viewed by many as the party of the market and of the state, not of society. So, ultimately, in relying on the central state to deliver economic goals, New Labour, and Labour more broadly, has been detrimental to the associational life of communities. The Purple Book. The Purple Book was produced by Blairite think tank Progress, with purple representing the colour of the marginal constituencies which Labour needs to win, Labour-Tory marginals. Blue, red, purple. Clever. The core thrust of this argument was that only a Blairite formula can win the next general election, in the same way that Blair won the 97, 2001 and 2005 general elections. For Douglas Alexander, New Labour consisted of personnel, policies and positions. The personnel might have changed. Policies need to be constantly reformulated in light of the socio-political context, but the core positions, economic competence and a strong approach to law and order are essential for the revival of the Labour Party. Purple Labour sees Blue Labour as too backwards looking. It harks back to an idealised Victorian idea of working class associationalism, which ignores massive changes in society and how we organise ourselves. Individualism is not just political, but economic and technological. Both strains reject the traditional project of state-led reform and regulation of capitalism, which was essential to the traditional task of British social democracy. Purple Labour tends to buy into the idea that markets are a better mechanism for the allocation of goods and services, and that the big society policy is a good agenda, whilst Blue Labour wants to see a re-emphasis of community over market and market demands. And then there were other intellectual projects, for example, the Red Book, which pushed for a return to old Labour. Now, this was much more powerful, subsumed into the idea of Corbynism following his election as leader. Well, clearly, it's too soon to really know what Starmerism is, if it even exists, but there are some hints we can pick up on which may help us understand where Starmer lies ideologically. Firstly, in the leadership contest, he was not the continuity Corbyn candidate. That was Rebecca Long-Bailey. He was seen to have pushed the party towards a more pro-second referendum position and a more Remain position against the wishes of Corbyn and his team. He also moved quickly on the issue of anti-Semitism, apologising to the Jewish community at the very start of his leadership and pledging to do better to tackle the anti-Semitism within Labour. However, due to the fact that he only entered Parliament in 2015 and spent most of his time on the front benches, he's been unable to flesh out an ideology in public away from the burdens of collective responsibility. Upon becoming leader, he did try to build a broad church within the shadow cabinet, but due to various issues, Corbynites have decreased in number in there. Now, his pledges during the leadership election suggest that he is to the left of New Labour, and probably Ed Miliband. Many commentators also claim that Starmer's issue with Corbynism was not the social or economic policies, but rather the lukewarm support for Remain, the lack of action on anti-Semitism, an inability of Corbyn to unite the party, and just a lack of general competence. And so what we have really in Starmer at the moment seems to be somebody who wants to prioritise or emphasise competence, but with very much a left-wing economic policy that is reminiscent or that draws support from the New Left. Finally, I've made this graph which shows the ideological placement of the Conservative and Labour parties along the economic and social dimension based on their manifestos in each election, except 2015, which isn't covered by the data, sadly. It's taken from the Chapel Hill Expert Survey data set, and what we can see, and here you'll have to excuse the labels, is that for Labour, from 1977 onwards, the party has moved, ignoring 2001, the party has moved more to the left in economic terms, and typically, once rid of Blair, more towards the post-materialist side. Whereas the Conservatives have been a little bit more all over the place. So in 1997, they were pretty much close to the middle of the top right quadrant. They moved slightly more to the right economically, but much more traditional in terms of social policy in 2001. Saw this didn't work, moved quite far the other way in post-materialist values in 2005, moved slightly to the right for 2010, and then 2017 kept their position on the left-right, but under May became a bit more traditional, possibly as a result of Brexit. And then under Johnson, moved slightly more to the left and much more, well, closer to the post-materialist axis, but again, not crossing it. So still more traditionalist, but a little bit more willing to move closer towards post-materialist values. Now, this might not tell us too much, but it does show that Labour's movement has been one-directional, by and large, whereas the Conservatives have been a bit more in flux in response to events. Okay, here are the seminar questions and also the class presentation projects. This is a reminder that your mark for the participation in the seminars is based on filling out the form, but is conditional on being involved with group work. So please do make sure you are in contact with your group and that the work presented in the presentations reflects everybody's contribution. If you have any questions about any part of this module or this presentation, feel free to drop me an email or come to my office hour Wednesday, 1 o'clock via Zoom.